borderlands marched an army into Wales, convinced he was going to execute a minor rebellion. He was wrong. What followed was not a battle, but a brutal, 30-minute slaughter so complete, it turned a respected lawyer into the rightful Prince of Wales. This is the story of Bryn Glas, the ambush that cost England hundreds of knights and crowned a rebel king. Owain Glyndwr had been a loyal man. He was a nobleman of undeniable pedigree, a descendant of the ancient princes of Powys and Deheubarth. Educated in the English Inns of Court, trained as a lawyer, and a seasoned veteran of English military campaigns in France and Scotland, he had lived an honourable life of service to the crown. He was a man of property, intelligence, and influence, everything the English establishment outwardly praised. But loyalty has limits. The test came when his neighbour, the greedy and vindictive Baron Reginald Grey of Ruthin, illegally seized a piece of Owain's inherited land. This was not a dispute over a fence line, but a direct affront to Owain's honour and the memory of his ancestors. He sought justice in the English court, presenting his case with legal precision, but the courts, designed to protect the powerful English landholders over the native Welsh gentry, turned their back. The injustice deepened when, in the summer of 1400, Owain, who was due a royal summons to accompany King Henry IV's crucial military campaign into Scotland, was deliberately and spitefully prevented from receiving it by Lord Grey. This was not merely a slight, it was a public humiliation, denying him the military service required of his rank and potentially labeling him a traitor by default. The shame was absolute. The refusal of the English crown to intervene was the final, profound betrayal. The educated, loyal Welsh gentleman realized a devastating truth. He could follow the king's law, but the king's law would never protect him. The time for petitioning was over. The time for action had come. At the age of 51, Owain stepped out of the shadow of the law and into the light of history. On the 16th of September, 1400, the unthinkable happened. Owain, with a small but determined group of loyal followers, launched a series of raids against the properties of his tormentor, Lord Grey of Ruthin. He was not merely acting as a disgruntled lord, he was being recognized by his countrymen. His supporters, long stifled by the harsh English edicts and yearning for a champion, saw in Owain not a rebel, but a prince. At a small village near Corwin, his followers proclaimed him Owain, Prince of Wales. The rebellion did not begin with a battle cry, but with a title, a formal, defiant claim to a stolen sovereignty that resonated through the valleys. The English crown's immediate reaction was one of contempt and confusion. They viewed Owain as a minor inconvenience, a bandit to be swatted away by the local marcher lords. King Henry IV personally led a massive army into North Wales that autumn, expecting to crush the minor uprising in a few weeks. But Henry found only an empty land. Owain and his forces, intimately familiar with the mountains and forests, executed a masterful strategy of avoidance, melting away before the slow-moving army could engage. The king's soldiers, frustrated by the lack of a formal battle, burned empty farms and took out their fury on the innocent populace, further fueling the widespread resentment that was already Owain's greatest weapon. This failure of the royal army to find and fight him was the first critical turning point. It gave the people of Wales a hero to rally around. Owain had not been crushed. He had disappeared, proving to his countrymen that the mountains would protect those who fought for the dragon standard. The momentum was now irreversible. Throughout the following year, the movement grew. Students abandoned their studies at the English universities, and dispossessed farmers and veterans flocked to his banner, forming a highly mobile, fiercely loyal guerrilla force. Owain, the veteran soldier, proved to be a masterful tactician in this new form of warfare. He avoided pitched battles and targeted symbolic centers of English power, castles, fortified towns, and especially the hated marcher lordships, whose wealth had been built on Welsh subjugation. He was not just fighting a war, he was restoring a national identity, proving that the ancient prophecies foretelling a native prince who would free Wales were finally coming true. This success, however, brought a chilling response from the English Parliament. King Henry, furious at the prolonged humiliation and expense of the war, passed a series of brutal laws designed to destroy the Welsh national spirit. Any Welshman was now entirely at the mercy of the English sheriff. Marriage between the English and the Welsh was outlawed. Gatherings were forbidden. The message was unmistakable: surrender your identity or be ground into dust. But the king's cruelty only ensured that the next English army sent into Wales would meet not just a rebel, but a storm of pure national fury. If you find this story of defiance against overwhelming odds compelling, please take a moment to subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this epic tale. The English lords, now facing financial ruin and the collapse of their authority, could no longer treat this as a minor disturbance. The key to the English grip on the borders was in the powerful hands of the Marcher lords, men like Sir Edmund Mortimer, a celebrated soldier, renowned for his command experience in Ireland and Scotland, and a relative of the royal family. Mortimer was an imposing figure, steeped in the pride and wealth that came with ruling the borderlands. He viewed the Welsh rebels not as worthy opponents, but as savages who needed a sharp, definitive lesson in the power of the crown. The task of extinguishing the fire, which had now burned for almost 2 years, fell directly to him. Mortimer would raise a substantial army, drawing professional soldiers and highly organized levies from his territories in Herefordshire and the surrounding counties. He was a general accustomed to victory, trained in the chivalric traditions of open battle, and he knew only one speed: fast and decisive. He had every reason to be confident. His forces were professional, heavily armored, and backed by the unquestioned prestige of the English name. Owain's forces, in contrast, were poorly equipped, driven by zeal, and considered barely an army at all. The coming confrontation would not be a duel. Mortimer fully expected it would be an execution. He advanced into central Wales, convinced that by forcing a single, decisive battle, he could end the rebellion and bring the legendary Welsh prince back to King Henry in chains. Mortimer was a general accustomed to victory, but he was too arrogant to realize Owain hadn't just raised an army, he had set a trap, and Mortimer was walking straight into the wires. The arrogance of the English and the desperation of the Welsh were now on a collision course, marching toward a small, innocent-looking valley in Radnorshire, where the fate of a nation would be decided in blood. The panic sweeping through the English border towns was no longer mere rumor. It was a devastating reality. Owain Glyndwr's raids had become relentless, cutting deep into the economic and political stability of the Marcher lords. Castles were captured, English sheriffs were killed, and farms were burned, not indiscriminately, but as calculated strikes against the symbols of oppression. The 2 years following the coronation had seen the rebellion escalate from an uprising into a full-scale national war. English administration in much of Wales had simply evaporated, replaced by the defiant authority of the Dragon Standard. To the proud and formidable Sir Edmund Mortimer, the very existence of the rebellion was an insult. Mortimer's primary objective was to force Owain into an open battle. He was trained to win on a grand scale, relying on disciplined formations of heavy cavalry and men-at-arms, precisely the kind of professional force that could crush a disorganized peasant army. In early June of 1402, Mortimer raised his banner, calling for a substantial levy from his territories in Herefordshire and beyond. His summons brought together a force that was the antithesis of Owain's army, well-equipped, heavily armored, and professional. The English knights were eager for glory and plunder, anticipating a swift campaign and an easy victory over what they considered a rabble. The foot soldiers, however, were often reluctant, levied men who simply wished to return to their fields. This army was heavy, built for brute force, and utterly confident that its presence alone would terrify the rebels into submission. Owain, meanwhile, was fighting a psychological war. Every successful raid proved that the English were not invincible, and that the ancient prophecies were indeed unfolding. His army was a testament to national fervor. It was composed of a small corps of experienced Welsh veterans and mercenaries, but its true strength lay in the archers and spearmen drawn from the hills, men whose local knowledge was a military asset Henry IV's generals could never match. They had mastered the art of disappearance and the sudden, devastating strike. The strategy of the Welsh was simple: avoid the English strength in the open field and wait for the perfect moment to exploit their arrogance. The differing mindsets were stark. Mortimer marched with the straight-line certainty of a military machine, believing that the sooner he found the Welsh, the sooner he would win. Owain, however, moved with the stealth of a hunter, allowing the heavy English column to penetrate deeper and deeper into the Welsh interior, exhausting itself on the march. Every mile Mortimer advanced was a mile further from his supply lines and a mile closer to the ground Owain had chosen. The valley near the River Lugg in Radnorshire possessed a deceptive beauty. The slopes of Bryn Glas, the Green Hill, were gentle, yet they perfectly framed the narrow route that Sir Edmund Mortimer's force was compelled to take. The English column, moving quickly and carelessly, paid scant attention to the high ground above the river. Mortimer, relying on an optimistic scouting report and eager to engage, led his men right into the terrain Owain had prayed for. Owain Glyndwr was a master of his native landscape. He had studied this area, known its sight lines and choke points, and recognized its potential to neutralize the enemy's formidable cavalry. His strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Use the terrain to condense the English fighting strength, then use the Welsh longbowmen to unleash an overwhelming firestorm at point-blank range. Owain's forces were already in position. His experienced archers were concealed high on the flanks of the valley, near the village of Pillith, virtually invisible against the summer foliage. They were men who had honed their skills hunting in the mountains, capable of incredible accuracy and motivated by an intense desire for vengeance. Their positions were such that once the English column was committed to the route, they could fire into the tightly packed ranks from both sides, creating a devastating crossfire. Mortimer's army, comprised of several thousand professional and levied soldiers, entered the valley with the confident tramp of an invading force. They had ignored the unsettling silence and the lack of any significant Welsh resistance up to this point, interpreting it as fear. When they finally came into sight of the main body of Owain's troops, they saw what they expected: a smaller, less armoured Welsh force positioned on a ridge ahead. This was merely bait. The arrogant English commander ordered his troops to advance, committing his professional men-at-arms to the narrow valley floor, exactly where they could be most effectively pinned. The Welsh forces holding the centre had been instructed to stand their ground until the devastating, unspoken signal was given. The tension must have been unbearable, the English heavy cavalry preparing to charge, the Welsh spearmen bracing for impact, and the hidden archers above holding their breath, waiting for the precise, fatal moment. The fate of Wales rested on the nerve of the men in the centre and the stealth of the men on the slopes. Everything was silent. They were waiting for the sound of the king's army marching to its death. The sound was not a battle cry. It was a deafening, percussive roar. Without warning, thousands of Welsh longbows loosed their first volleys. The air above the valley was instantly choked with arrows, which rained down from the concealed positions on Bryn Glas, striking the tightly packed English ranks from both the left and the right. The transition from an orderly march to utter pandemonium was instantaneous and absolute. The English soldiers were compressed by the narrowness of the valley, their ranks too tight to effectively raise shields or dodge the barrage. The arrows, loosed at relatively close range, tore through mail, found the gaps in plate armor, and felled horses with brutal efficiency. The English cavalry, their greatest asset, was instantly neutralized as their mounts stumbled and fell, creating impenetrable obstacles and collapsing the advance. Mortimer's strategy, built on a swift, disciplined charge, was shattered before the first man-at-arms could properly draw his sword. As the English forces reeled from the initial volley, the second, more fatal strike was delivered by betrayal. Among the English forces were levies from Gwent, Welshmen forced to fight for the crown. Whether by prior arrangement or by a sudden, unifying frenzy of national loyalty, these men chose the moment of greatest English vulnerability to turn on their commanders. They dropped their English banners and, raising the cry of the dragon, fell upon the panicked English centre, stabbing and hacking at their former comrades. This act of calculated vengeance completely dissolved the English command structure. With the English army in a state of chaos, the main Welsh force, led by Owain himself, charged down the ridge. It was a charge fueled by 2 years of pent-up rage and nationalist fervour. The fighting quickly devolved into a bloody, desperate melee. The heavily armoured English, trapped by the terrain and surrounded by the relentless Welsh spearmen, found their costly equipment a liability rather than a defence. The Welsh, light on their feet, used their knowledge of the ground to run rings around the floundering knights. The slaughter was immense. English losses were catastrophic, numbering several hundred knights and squires, a staggering number of the professional fighting elite. Owain's forces showed no quarter, driven by a desire to repay centuries of injustice in a single, brutal hour. The ultimate prize was the capture of Sir Edmund Mortimer himself, who was taken alive amidst the wreckage of his shattered army. The Battle of Bryn Glas, or Pillith, was not merely a victory, it was an annihilation, establishing Owain Glyndwr as a military force of genius and a leader of undeniable, terrifying power. Do not forget to leave a comment with which historical figure you want us to cover next, and share this video with one friend who needs to know this incredible story of the ultimate underdog victory. Silence descended upon the valley, the sudden, eerie quiet of a battleground the morning after. The sight was horrific. Hundreds of English dead lay where they had fallen, a silent, bloody testament to the scale of the annihilation. The immediate aftermath was marked by a chilling act of collective retribution. Driven by centuries of oppression, the Welsh women who followed the army descended upon the English bodies. Historical accounts describe them performing brutal acts of mutilation, an act of savage vengeance against the men who had enforced the king's humiliating laws. This barbarity, shocking to the English chronicles, underscored the depth of hatred and the national fury that Owain had unleashed. The true prize was the captive, Sir Edmund Mortimer. A royal cousin and one of the most powerful men in the march, Mortimer was now Owain's prisoner. The ransom demanded by the Welsh prince was astronomical, but King Henry IV, bitter and wary, refused to pay a single penny for his ransom. The king feared that paying to free Mortimer would validate the rebellion and elevate Owain's status. Henry's decision was a catastrophic miscalculation. Rejected by his own monarch, Mortimer took the only path available. He swore allegiance to his captor and married Owain's daughter, Catherine. The powerful Mortimer family, and their claim to the English throne, now became a key asset of the Welsh rebellion. The political shockwave that ripped through England was profound. The scale of the loss at Bryn Glas was an undeniable military humiliation that shattered King Henry's authority and sparked the formation of a dangerous conspiracy. Owain, emboldened by the victory and the accession of Mortimer, seized the moment. In a symbolic act of ultimate sovereignty, he established a full Welsh parliament, the first in the country's history at Machynlleth. Here, he was formally crowned, solidifying his transformation from a dispossessed nobleman to the Prince of Wales. This battle, fought in a forgotten valley, was Owain Glyndwr's high water mark. It was proof that a unified Welsh nation, led by genius and driven by righteous fury, could indeed defeat the greatest military power in Europe. Bryn Glas ensured that for the next decade, Wales would be a truly independent nation. The fight for freedom had only just begun, but the seemingly impossible victory at Bryn Glas had given the Welsh something far more valuable than territory: hope. This is a story that proves history isn't always made by the largest armies, but sometimes by the biggest hearts. If you want to see more stories about the incredible battles that shaped our world and hear the full saga of Owain Glyndwr's defiance, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell for more history.